First of all, I just want to welcome everybody. I got to know Rachel a few years ago when the Saudi and other, but principally Saudi effort to exploit the extremely plaintiff-friendly libel laws of Great Britain decided to use a few trillion of their dollars and to expand their power and authority, not having been satisfied with having had a book burning at Cambridge University of a book that was critical of them. This massive machine was on one side, and on the other were, for a time, several major publications in the United States, famous leading newspapers and magazines. They all caved. One person didn't cave. She's sitting on my left. She took on the Saudis and their trillions, and she basically won. Rachel's law is now law in New York and I think 4 or 5 other jurisdictions, and there's a version 12 that keeps growing. And there are federal statutes that are working in this direction. She changed a lot with her incredible stubbornness and intelligence and ability. I got to say, I think stubbornness for me is an extremely positive virtue, and Rachel certainly demonstrated it in this. The American Center for Democracy, which I'm on the board of and which she chairs, has done a great deal to bring issues such as economic warfare to the front of policymakers' discussions here in Washington. We had a session chaired by Senator John Kyle a couple of years ago, and then one at George Mason with Chairman Mike Rogers, Chair of House Intelligence, and others, one on EMP. ACD's published over 500 articles on these and related issues in their daily blog, and they are particularly focused heavily on terrorist financing, the financial picture of what's happening with the radical Islamist movements such as the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and Hezbollah, in not only in the Middle East but well beyond. Let me just say a very quick word about the scope of what we hope to talk about and swap some ideas on today. First of all, for as Peter Pry keeps saying and hopefully is succeeding in restructuring the terminology to some extent. When we talk about cyber, we tend to include electromagnetic pulse. It is so included by the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and the Iranians. And not because they are exactly the same thing, but because their functions of sort of total information warfare overlap. And some of the technologies that are relevant to one are relevant to the other, and some of the protective technologies that are relevant to one are relevant to the other. So although one important focus is to ensure that when people don't spend much time on security and focus their attention on, quote, smart grids and kind of blink like deer in the headlights when you tell them that the way they're doing their smart grids looks like it's not only going to be possible for you to turn down the thermostat in your house via your cell phone, but a teenager in Shanghai to do the same thing to your house. And perhaps other far more mischievous undertakings. Most of the people who work on cyber security, and particularly who are interested in smart grid, are very difficult to yaw around to focusing on some of the security aspects rather than just the technological, isn't it fun, look what we can do with the internet, the smart grid. So we plan to look at traditional cyber, but also, of course, at EMP, both solar caused and malevolently caused. And that is a huge subject, one that is just beginning to break into the public discussion. It's been helped immeasurably, Bill, by your writings, Bill, by your novel and others. There are just a lot of people that are, Peter have started in one way or another bringing this issue to the fore. It is insidious because if you look at the vulnerability from intentionally caused EMP, it's a much simpler task than designing and developing and testing and targeting let's say an ICBM or an SLBM that can hit a target on the ground. If all you have to do is get 30 clicks or more up into space and get in some rough orbit and get over some portion of the United States and detonate, either salvage fused if somebody shoots something at you, or just detonate, you could have a massive effect without being accurate at all, and even try a shot around the South Pole, and if that doesn't work, don't say anything and go try another one later. There are just a number of vulnerabilities that stem from the nature of electromagnetic pulse that people really are so appalled by, they often don't want to deal with the matter at all. And in some ways, this is our biggest problem, that some of the difficulties that we face here, in particular the takedown, or comparatively easy takedown of major portions of, or even in some circumstances all of the North American electrical grid, creates a situation where people just say, this is just too hard, this is just too massive, it's too scary, I'm going to go do something else. Part of what we need to do is make sure people understand that in a lot of circumstances, we're talking about the massive expenditure of roughly 20 cents per electricity consumer per year on some of the important types of steps that can usefully be taken. So part of what we need to do is understand the way one can utilize technology in a very affordable way to make a real difference in our vulnerabilities to cyber and its related threats. I want to close by just saying a word about the issue of physical survivability of the grid. I got a call from Amory Lovins a few months ago, who is an old friend of my wife's and mine, and has his finger in lots of pots, and one of them was, he said, "Jim, do you realize there was an attack in just north of San Jose a couple of months ago by a very disciplined groups with AK-47s taking out the 911 emergency call capacity and taking out 17 of the 20 transformers that supply the electricity to the valley?" And I said, "Duh, no, I didn't know." Turned out it was covered in the San Jose press a little bit, kind of, sort of, as vandalism at electrical facility. But if you look back at the movies, the films that were taken, this and that and the other thing, it turns out there were 3 or 4 extremely disciplined guys with AK-47s. Timing was perfect, deployment was perfect, destruction of the 911 system was perfect, except they couldn't get at the 911 calls that went from cell phones. And that is what one person did hear, the rifle fire that was going after the transformers, and did channel some people from the electrical company to see what was going on. Actually, the highway patrol came by first, and they didn't see anything wrong. They didn't know what a transformer was or why it wouldn't have holes in it or should not have holes in it. And so they kind of went on, and finally they showed up several hours later and realized how close they had come, this group had come, to taking out 17 of the 20 transformers for Silicon Valley. A piece on the web within the last few days indicates that something rather similar a month or so ago happened in Arkansas. The first one, by the way, happened the day after the Boston Marathon bomb explosion, so might have been timed very carefully along with that. So although it's not quite at the level of ability to destroy and take down systems that one would see from an electromagnetic pulse shot or a very clever cyber attack, physical attacks are possible, and again, like the cyber and the included case of EMP, some of the fixes are really pretty simple and pretty cheap. And a lot of these fixes are not necessarily perfect fixes, but they're things like taking a transformer that has fulfilled most of its useful life but still has some utility left and putting it in, say, a little stone house somewhere near where it's needed, instead of throwing it away or disposing of it. There are just a number of steps that one can take this overall area of vulnerability of the grid.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the age of space and cyber warfare. And I'll tell you that the number one greatest threat that we face is the lack of imagination to understand that these are very real and credible threats. When I say welcome to the age of space and cyber warfare, I have to point out that we've ignored it, overlooked it, or pretended it didn't happen, or didn't attribute it correctly. But there is a proud 30 or 40 year tradition of space and cyber warfare in this world. It's been engaged by not just superpowers or lesser powers, but third world nation powers very effectively. Now, when I say engagements, and when I'm talking about warfare, I'm talking about the use of engagement for political purpose. There are people out there that have a vested interest in making sure that the sensors that are on those satellites or the information that they route don't get to their receivers. There's also a similar vested interest in making sure information from the internet doesn't get to where it belongs. Now, we're much more familiar with cyber because it's so prolific and we interact with it every day in our own personal lives at every opportunity that we can get. If any of you are addicted to your iPhone or Crackberry, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. But wow, what we call cyber warfare today evolved out of space warfare. Space warfare. A satellite is nothing more than a computer put into space where everybody on the Earth has a fabulous vantage point and view of it. Of course, that's one of the attributes of a space system. It's got such a fabulous view of the Earth, but it works both ways. A satellite is a computer that has a sensor, and it routes information. It's incredibly vulnerable. Incredibly vulnerable. Now, there are a lot of people out there that make a lot of noise about direct ascent or even co-orbital ASATs that will impact and blow up satellites on orbit. And we've seen these things tested, or we've heard claims that what was tested was actually an anti-satellite weapon. It's far more likely that that type of technology was used for missile defense-related technologies rather than a direct anti-satellite weapon. Here's why I say this. A sailor knows enough not to mine his own harbors. And a soldier knows enough not to put minefield in his own camp. Well, a space professional knows enough not to blow up every bit of matter in outer space or to take out a satellite, because you have to live with that debris like its own minefield for, well, it could be generations. And when I say generations, I'm speaking about a satellite's generation, which is roughly equivalent to a dog's life, 7 years. So the dog life standard of a generation for space is something that we all need to take into account. Now, when I talk about space warfare, the examples I give are always unclassified and easy for each of us to research on the internet. We have to be widely aware that Iran is one of the most prolific counter-space powers out there, routinely jamming not only European news going into the Middle East, but also jamming U.S. UAV traffic, the satellites that are carrying the command and control lines for UAVs going into the Middle East. In fact, they're so clever about this, a few years back, they sent 2 of their people to Cuba and were jamming out the window of a hotel room with their equipment. It took us a great deal of time to figure out who it was that was doing that, and I have to also compliment the Cuban government. They were very responsive to make sure that they did not get accused of this act. But the Iranians had been asked, why are you jamming the broadcast coming into the Middle East? And the response that they gave over in Geneva a few years back was really kind of telling, and I think we need to pay a little bit of attention to what they argued. It's better than blowing up ground stations in Europe. And without even being aware of it, they had just invoked the law of armed conflict. The law of armed conflict requires me as a military member to take any non-lethal and non-destructive means of achieving my objectives, whenever doing so can be clearly demonstrated, so that I can, the criteria that we're given, reduce human loss of life and suffering and loss of property. And so you see, engagements against satellites is a very palatable type of option. Plus, if I develop an anti-satellite weapon that goes into space on the end of a rocket and blows up, I've got a few problems with that. First, it's going to cost me millions of dollars to develop that rocket and to employ it on each and every occasion. It's going to cost me billions of dollars, probably in equivalent funds from around the world, to develop a impact type of device that would impact a satellite. Next, just the simple act of engagement is something that is not going to go undetected. And typically, you're not going to go to a third-party country to do this type of launch. So it's immediately attributable. This is the problem that we have with not only space, but cyber. Number one, what is the probability of detection? Do I even know that I've been attacked? Oftentimes we don't. Sometimes the technique, a cyber technique, is something that was buried in a code of data stream through sabotage that you won't even know about it until the designated time comes. Probability of detection is difficult. Second, the probability of attribution. Who do I think did this? Now, there's some times where you're almost at a loggerhead and a war with a different country, and it's almost obvious at least who's acting on somebody's behalf. However, in the cyber world, we've seen, for example, in the case of the Russians, back during their execution against Chechnya, they merely let it be known that all the hacktivists in their country, hey, you're free to have at the Chechen Republic, or Georgia, excuse me, I'm using the example of Georgia. And of course, what we saw was the takedown of the Georgian internet and the capture of their data systems. And so it doesn't even need to be a nation state. We are living in the age of the super-empowered individual, where the lone individual has at his fingertips, and with small collectives of other people, nation-like capabilities that only nations had about 10 years ago. You know, we've heard about Stuxnet, we've heard about Iron Storm, we've heard about all these different types of attack methodologies that are out there, but as the former director pointed out, there's a 17-year-old out there right now who's every bit as capable today, given the ideas that hit the internet and spread like wildfire, that can configure a type of attack that we are not even imaginatively prepared to deal with. 9/11 was made possible by the lack of imagination that anybody would use aircraft in that manner. A lock on a door, securing the cabins of a cockpit, a few rules and procedures, and this type of attack would never have happened. And the price of converting those aircraft to save them, again, as the director points out, oftentimes is not that expensive. Oftentimes, in space and in cyber, it's a matter of just changing up the way you do business on some unpredictable pattern that changes the predictability that an adversary needs to engage against you. As we shift our attention from a Western perspective to a more Eastern mindset, we need to understand that in Asia, as Sun Tzu wrote 26 centuries ago, all warfare is based on deception. That which you use the most and rely on the most, you must appear to use the least and rely on the least. And the reverse is true. What is inconsequential to you must be broadcast as the most important thing that you have and your greatest vulnerability, so an adversary wastes their intelligence and their time gathering against that. There is a reason why the Russian word for counterintelligence is konspirovsko. It's interesting. Hide inside create conspiracies and hide inside it so that you can't be attributed. Probability of attribution is going to remain a single large problem. The director of the NSA, former director, made a comment at Air University a couple weeks ago that the lack of attribution for activities that people are taking on the internet was his principal problem in knowing that you have a problem, and the ability to identify who did it enables you to pick your appropriate kind of response. Here's the problem. If you don't know if you can't detect you have a problem, and you can't attribute who did it, how do you develop deterrence against these kinds of threats? Now, in the past, we used the policy of deterrence as our defense. But this is very arcane to the Chinese, and there's a lot of writing about this that you can find. Deterrence is not something that's a bluff. Deterrence is real, credible, almost proactive engagement to shape the environment through the use of coercion. Interesting. So our Cold War mindset that Thomas Schelling wrote about so convincingly back in the 1950s about the ability to deter through shows of strength and force and commitment and resolve, this type of idea may not actually be what is in play against major nation states as we do the pivot from the west towards the east. We need to be prepared for that. That'll be a cultural mind shift. But the worst case of all is those super empowered individuals. This is on the mind of the NSA as they developed their current schema under FISA of what they observe, how they observe it, and how they process the information that flows regularly across the internet. And while the Snowden disclosure shocked many, the United States is not the only nation that's in that game. And I would not even score us as first or second in that game in terms of collection of content and processing and utilization of it. There's a lot that's going on in this cyber world that we have yet to get our arms around, and it's going to change. There are types of cyber technologies coming down the pipe that are being delivered by the gaming community into the hands of children that you will not, it will strike your sensitivities. There's a project that was designed to create better prosthetics, mechanical prosthetics for veterans. And the study procedure utilized a bicycle helmet that was hollowed out with a series of electroencephalogram monitors on it, placed on the head of an individual to pattern the brain waves as they interact with physical stimuli, etc. But what they also determined is they can run this helmet information into a computer, and then they can show you a movie, and then they can observe your brain doing the learning in relationship to this movie. And then after they show you this 4-hour movie where they take breaks, they can turn the movie off, and then they can start asking you questions. And they're already catching the fragments of thoughts with the ability to read some of it. It's just snippets. And for some reason, humans think about hippopotamuses every 30 seconds. And so there's a lot that's involved with this type of information gathering. Match this to the type of technology that's going on to create handless devices. They're working on projects of Wi-Fi that don't necessarily go machine to machine where you have that machine in your hand. They're talking about doing this Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi using the human neuro frequencies so that you can simply sit there and interact with a visual device simply by thinking about it. We haven't been able to break through the barrier where we can insert stimulation into your brain where you experience visual and auditory. Well, some people claim they have, but they usually get locked up. But what we really need to be cognizant of, the cyber community is going to change. I anticipate that the sixth form of warfare to add to air, land, sea, space, and cyber is actually going to be, what would we call it? Psychic warfare? Mental warfare? Where we may have the opportunity of injecting what we want you to think into your brain or extracting the information we want to get from you without you even knowing that your nervous system is being accessed. Now, we're years off from this. In our lives, we interact with the media and we know that we can turn the channel. Imagine if you can't. Imagine if you don't get to select the information that you're accessing. Michio Kaku, the great futurist and physicist who's done a great deal to popularize string theory, he's one of the founders of string theory. He talks about, back during the war, there was a Frenchman who, he was kind of a futurist, and he studied like the expos and things like that. But he anticipated quite presciently, going to the moon, and he anticipated the Americans, the greatest tinkerers in the world at that time, with all the mass that he could see growing, that the United States was able to bring to bear on problems. The United States would probably be the first nation to go to the moon. And he said, rockets, the things that the Chinese have, and that so long ago, and now that they've been developed to this point, it'd probably be by a chemical rocket. But weight is a big problem, but I've talked to people and said they'll probably stage these things. And you wouldn't send one person, probably not even two, you'd probably send 3. And if America does it, they'll probably do it from that great landmass Florida, because they can go either east or west off of it and bring them back and splash into the ocean. The war I'm talking about is the American Civil War, and it was 1865 when Jules Verne penned this, A Visitor to Paris, in the 20th century. There is a very real future science community out here. I represented them for a number of years with the Air Force when I was the head of DreamWorks back at the Pentagon, and then at the Center for Strategy and Technology at Maxwell. The future exists today, and when you go to a science and technology conference, it's interesting what they present. But you want to get that person off on the side who has all this brilliance and this genius, and you ask him, what's your pet project that you're really working on in your garage? And that's how Jules Verne was able to predict 100 years later that it'd be America that would go to the moon. So with this, I ask you to keep your imagination open. I know I've thrown out a very compelling thought there at the end about how cyber could evolve even further. But I'm still very optimistic about the future, and it's with engagements and discussions like this that we will learn and that we will be able to inform and advise the type of people to make better policy decisions in the future.
My background was in the history of technology, and I want to just spend just 1 minute. How did I wind up in the field of EMP threat? By coincidentally, on the day that the congressional report on the threat of EMP came out, which was chaired by Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, and this gentleman, Dr. Pry, was a very key moving force in that. I happened to be in D.C. on the same day. And in a discussion that evening with Newt, the comment came up that there was zero response to this report. He asked me to go over to talk to Congressman Bartlett, who inspired me with a very simple observation that the problem truly is that there's no constituency. Mention EMP to any group of citizens, and you're nowhere. Mention any number of other issues. The one I like to point out is we might recall that horrific incident about 4 years back of a woman who was attacked by a chimpanzee and her face was destroyed. Congress passed a law outlawing the ownership of chimpanzees. So you're safe when you come to my house now. But the point is, what's the probability threat there of any of us being attacked in such a manner versus the threat of EMP? I was inspired by the classics of my youth, particularly Alas, Babylon and On the Beach. Thus, I wrote the book with the intent of trying to get a popular novel out there that took a complex issue and put it into a small community, and what happens to each one of us individually, what happens to us, our parents, our children, our town. And the book has 12 weeks on the NYT list. I want to shift into some of the things that, as my background in military history and the history of technology and how it applies to warfare, and that is the issue of EMP. EMP is a first strike weapon, and it's a technological game changer. And throughout the history of warfare, we have always seen that the losing side in a war often trumps the victor in the next conflict by rethinking the paradigm. A very simple example is Crécy and Agincourt, where the M1 tanks of their time, the French armored nobility, suddenly encountered English longbows. Thus we see all the way to the present of a technology that's been dismissed or recently realized trumps what's considered to be the existing dominant force on the battlefield. What is the first thing that Sun Tzu talks about, and almost every military writer, in the opening moves of warfare, and that is destruction of command and control. If you can shut down command and control of your opponent, you have pretty well won the issue before battle is even joined. What is the best way currently to take out command and control? It would be cyber attack or EMP. I was thinking last night about something of the issue of morale. I recently read that what really broke the morale was not necessarily the being pushed back in North Africa or the debacle on the Eastern Front. It was men going home on furlough or wounded or getting letters and seeing that city after city after city was being leveled. That while they fought on the front lines, their wives, their children, their parents, their families, their homeland was being flattened. That is truly what was breaking the morale of the German troops. I remember talking with a German soldier, a veteran of the Russian front, who said the most terrifying experience of his life was he happened to be in Hamburg when it was hit. And he said it shook him for the rest of the war. He realized we were going to lose, as he put it. So we see a command and control, a first strike via EMP or cyber attack as a decapitation of information, command and control, but also strikes morale. And then you have societal breakdown. We need not go through an exercise here of what happens if the electricity turns off in the next minute and what happens to this city within the hour. But, as an old hero of mine, Rod Serling, once said, present it for your consideration. Present it for your consideration if on 9/11 we all saw the first minute of the impact on the second tower and the Pentagon, and then the entire news grid went down. Think of the panic that would have struck across the country within the hour. We have been used, ever since the age of telegraphy, to having instant access to information. And particularly within the last 15 years, I'm a college teacher as well. If my kids walk out of the classroom and they can't immediately text their boyfriend or in the classroom or their parents, they're trying a panic attack. Think of the shutdown of command and control, but also the communication grid of a civilian society. What happens next? It's a grim proposition. One of the things that I found difficult in communicating the threat of EMP and cyber attack, the good analogy to that is what the film On the Beach created. How many of you have actually seen the film On the Beach or read the book? To this day, if I hear Woolsey and Matilda in the background, I'm suddenly in tears, all right? It was on TV just a couple of days ago. I read an article a while back pointing out that On the Beach played a contributing factor in the shutting down of the American civil defense system that had been developed in the 40s and the 50s. The reason being that when On the Beach came out, it presented such an overwhelming, catastrophic view of thermonuclear war as a planet-destroying event that the attitude then became, why in hell are we even bothering to try and prepare our infrastructure, build command and control centers, dig the bunker in the backyard? It's all meaningless. The infamous line, the living will envy the dead. That is the problem that we here face today. How do we convince the general populace, the voters, the people up on the Hill, that the cyber threats that you're talking about, which sound sci-fi to some, but I'm sitting here going, gosh, that's a great book. How do we convince that these are real? EMP, thanks to Dr. Pry and so many others, is starting to come through as a reality. But it seems so overwhelming that most people react with, oh hell, somebody else will figure it out. Or, I'll go back to my Xbox. I do see glimmers of light. There are constituencies that are starting to react. How many of you are familiar with the state of Maine recently? An incredible experience. And okay, I'll throw it out there. She read a couple of books about EMP, bothered her, and I'm not just referring to mine, I'm referring to others. Even if we're not seeing success from the federal level, we are starting to see success from the state level. Developing command and control nodes that are survivable, addressing issues of cybersecurity, and hardening infrastructure against EMP. That's the goal that NOAA Foundation, they're just down the road from me, and they've been working aggressively on it, both politically and within the community. We have to build the we're having a remarkable experience here today, but we're all preaching to the choir. How do we build a broader constituency to react to make sure it doesn't happen?
Well, first, I actually haven't been president of EMPACT America for a couple of years. Now I'm the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, which is a congressional advisory board on these issues. We work for the Congressional EMP Caucus. And before that, I worked on the House Armed Services Committee, and before that, the CIA. And I've spent all of my professional life working on weapons of mass destruction, including EMP. And this is the one that has always concerned me the most, because it is the least understood, and it can do the most damage with the smallest investment. But let me talk about some of the good news here, because I think everybody already knows about the threat and how catastrophic it would be. But one of the things that makes this so tragic is there's really no excuse for the country to be vulnerable to EMP. We have known for decades, how to protect military systems against it, and it's far easier to protect the civilian grid against it. You know, there are things like Faraday cages and surge arresters that can be used. The heart of the grid is these EHV extremely high voltage transformers. You know, they are to our civilization what the aqueducts were to the Romans. You know, you can't have a grid and you can't have a modern society without these EHV transformers. They aren't built in this country anymore. They were invented here by Nikola Tesla, and they were originally built here. We exported the electric grid to the world. But unfortunately, like so many things, we don't make it here anymore. There's only 2 countries in the world that make EHV transformers for export, you know, South Korea and Germany. And the worldwide production of EHV transformers is 180 per year, because the windings have to be done by hand, the old-fashioned way, just the way Nikola Tesla did them. And we have about 3,000 EHV transformers in this country. So it doesn't take a genius, you know, to do the arithmetic that if you lose 1,000 EHV transformers, how many years will it take? And it doesn't take a year for people to starve to death massively, which is why the Commission estimated that, you know, that within a year, given our current state of unpreparedness of a nuclear or natural EMP, because the sun can do this too, by means of a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection. And that is an actual photograph taken from our SOHO satellite, December 2012, when we entered the solar maximum of our Carrington-class coronal mass ejection. You may not be able to see it, but this little blue dot is the relative size of the Earth compared to one of these coronal mass ejections. And so you don't need to be an astrophysicist to understand that if this hits that, it's going to ruin your whole day. A Carrington event could be even worse than a super EMP weapon, because it would cause an EMP worldwide and collapse electric grids everywhere. But yet again, the technology is understood. It's relatively inexpensive. You know, the highest estimate that we've got is about $2 billion to protect the whole country. And as we've looked at different plans, we've been able to bring the price down so that it's down now around $500 million, according to some plans. And there are 3 plans. There are many ways of doing it. There's 3 plans described in the book about how to protect the country, but we can't get people. We haven't been able to get the Congress to do it. I actually was going to be selfish in coming here today, because have this audience be sort of a therapist for me, because I'm extremely alarmed at what is not being reported in our news. And you know, while it's fascinating to talk about the future, I frankly am increasingly concerned that we may not have any future, given how blind we are about what's going on and what isn't being talked about. I mean, it's appalling to me that here, the whole focus of the media reporting and what we're focused on the town in this town today, you know, is over sequestration, over the budget, you know, whether the government is going to shut down tomorrow. Let me talk about just 3 things going back, I guess, 4 weeks ago, over the past 4 weeks, things that have happened that I find extremely disturbing, but that weren't reported or were barely reported in the press. I think it was the 2nd of September on a Monday when Israel did that unannounced anti-missile test. It's all over the Russian press, but to my knowledge, not mentioned at all, except in one article I wrote for Lignet, that that the Russians had the General Staff Command Post went on alert in response to that and notified Vladimir Putin that unknown missiles were coming out of the Med, headed towards Syria, where they have a fleet. Now, they likened this, their deputy defense minister likened this to the January 1995 incident. They did this, not me, which was the closest we ever came to a nuclear war. And they reminded, that they told an international press that on the 25th of January 1995, when they had detected an unannounced Norwegian meteorological rocket, you know, they had nearly pushed the button over that, you know, because they had not been notified. And they likened this thing that happened back in September to the January 1995 incident, which was the closest we ever came. It's the only time to all 3 Chegets, which is their equivalent of the nuclear football, the presidential football, except 3 people can launch nuclear strikes in Russia, as opposed to only the president here. You know, the chief of the general staff, the defense minister, and the president. All 3 of those Chegets were activated, and basically, Kalashnikov, the chief of the general staff, was yelling at Yeltsin, who was the president at the time, to push the button. And it was only Boris Yeltsin, an alcoholic, you know, who couldn't believe the United States was going to launch a surprise nuclear attack out of the blue. He waited, he paused, you know, the 10 minutes, and that's what spared us. That's how close we came. And they claimed on 2nd of September, that because of what the Israelis did, that this was another incident, a nuclear war scare. You'd be surprised at how long it takes to set up that red phone. You know, it takes a day. Yeah, it takes a day. You can't actually pick up the red phone, and, there's a whole State Department bureaucracy involved with the red phone.
Has to be a red cell phone these days.
Yeah, right. The other thing that another fact is that Russian fleet that nobody seems to think much of, I mean, the Russians are closely allied with Syria. They've made it clear that their national interests are tied up in there. There are probably tactical nuclear weapons on that Russian fleet. Where do people think these 8,000 tactical nuclear weapons the Russians have are? In storage? We know from their exercises, their military writings, that these things play a very important role in their defense plans. The Moskva, which is now the flagship of the Russian fleet in Syria, during the Cold War, we understood that thing carried tactical nuclear weapons that had yields of 300 kilotons, on anti-ship missiles. So, that Russian fleet has probably got tactical nuclear weapons on it. The whole thing strikes me as like 1914 all over again, where where the president passed the buck to Congress. Now, and the Congress and the president, now that we're engaged in negotiations, our fleet is still there. We've passed the buck to our guys and to the Russian fleet as well, who are going to be watching each other because they have no alternative with their national technical means, like Hawks, just in case something should happen. What if there's some kind of a glitch with a satellite? What if the Hezbollah or Iran or somebody who would love to see the United States and Russia get into a nuclear war with each other decides to use cyber warfare to try to convince, or they're small. The Iranians have got anti-silk missiles from China. They've got sunburn missiles from the Russians, to attack our guys and start a war like 1914. You've got all these actors, many of whom have an interest in seeing us go to war with each other. Well, let me just step through a couple of other headlines that should have been, that things that have happened over the past few weeks that have really bothered me, that our own Western media has largely ignored them. After Obama struck the great deal with Putin, and they went into negotiations, Syria had crossed the chemical red line, but now they're going to go into negotiations.
Pink line. It was only a pink line.
Pink line, right. North Korea started the Yongbyon reactor, and that has gone virtually unreported, which is crossing another red line. That was supposed to be a red line with North Korea, that they were not going to restart that reactor, but they did. And not even Fox News has mentioned it. That produces enough plutonium for 2 atomic bombs a year. On Friday, Maritz, an Israeli newspaper, reported that based on interviews with Israeli experts, who have elected to remain anonymous, they believe that the red line in Iran has already been crossed, and that it is too late to stop Iran from getting them. That Iran has probably already developed at least one nuclear weapon. And I think that is so. Congressman Bartlett and I, 2 years ago, wrote an article in the Washington Times pointing out, and it just kind of, it does astonish me that we have this, we truly are a culture of strategic optimists, I mean, here's a country that's had a nuclear weapons program for 30 years. 30 years. And supposedly in 30 years, they haven't been able to build an atomic bomb. When the United States in World War II, in the Manhattan Project, working with 1930s and 1940s era technology, built 2 atomic bombs of completely different design in just 3 years. And the Iranians have had the help from North Korea, the Russians, the Chinese, and yet they still supposedly, there's still a year before they're going to get to the bomb. Why do we think that? Because the Iranians have told the IAEA inspectors, supposedly, exactly how many centrifuges they really have, and based on our calculations. But if you pull all of this together, the EMP, the cyber warfare, the doctrine, the adversary doctrine, which among the Russians, the Chinese, North Korean, to them, cyber warfare, information warfare, is not just computer viruses, but it includes kinetic attacks, like those AK-47s that were used in San Jose, all the way up to nuclear EMP attack. And it's almost like over the past several years, we've seen a dry run happening where all of these things have happened. They've been attacking us, maybe not doing everything that they could. I think that these things are more like exploratory scouting expeditions to see how vulnerable, our critical infrastructures really are with their viruses and those kinds of attacks. Now we've had a couple of instances where we've had kinetic attacks on transformers. The San Jose one, clearly professionally. They haven't found those so-called vandals. We don't know who they were, and they were using AK-47s when they did it. And the last part, well, where's the EMP in this? And that, not just theoretical. That North Korean freighter that was stopped for smuggling drugs into Panama, had SA-2 missiles on it. That is a nuclear-capable surface-to-air missile. The Russians designed it so that it could carry a nuclear warhead. Now, it didn't have a nuclear warhead on it, but it's just fascinating that just by accident, because they were investigating that thing for smuggling drugs, that we found that here's a North Korean vessel that had a nuclear-capable missile, in the Caribbean, which is the EMP Commission's nightmare scenario. Our worst-case scenario was that Iran or North Korea or somebody, would put a short-range missile or some kind of a missile on a freighter and do an EMP attack on a freighter and launch it up over the east coast of the United States. And here we've actually found a freighter that had a nuclear-capable missile in it just by accident when it was trying to go through the Panama Canal. How many other things have been going on like that? So you've got all the building blocks here. I wonder how much time we have. I wonder how much time, There's just the complexity of our world now and all the different pathways in which things could lead to an apocalypse. 99 years ago, this August just passed, World War I started because the political military leaders at the time were overwhelmed by the technology of the time. The technology involved in the act of mobilizing armies, was something they didn't anticipate, the complexity of it, the risks of trying to de-escalate that once mobilization had started. And so all it took was one bullet from a Serbian terrorist to set us down a path that the great minds of the time, the political military leaders and the crowned heads of Europe could not control. How much more complex is the technology and the difference between war and peace today? Then the decision between war and peace was based on days and weeks. Now it's minutes and seconds. And extremely potentially fallible and cyber vulnerable satellite systems and early warning systems and all kinds of bad guys out there who would love to see an apocalypse that would take out the United States and Russia both. Just one last thing I want to mention. Thursday, the Russians finished Zapad 13, which is a big military exercise that they held. Again, another thing that hasn't gone mentioned while they're negotiating with us on behalf of the Syrians. And this exercise, by the way, was witnessed by President Putin and Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. It was a joint exercise between Russia and Belarus that in a matter of a couple of days delivered 22,000 troops from central Russia to the gates of Poland and the Baltic states. So just another thing that, that the Western press seems to have no interest in whatsoever and might cast a certain, perhaps raise some questions about the sincerity of our Russian negotiating partners in Syria and the like. Anyway, thank you for letting me get all those events off my chest.
John Kenneth Galbraith once said, only a fool tries to predict the future. So if that's so, there's an abundance of well-paid jokers in prestigious think tanks and on cable TV talk shows around these days. However, a much larger and less well-paid group of hopelessly afflicted prognosticators can be found in the ranks of fiction writers. Science fiction and techno-thrillers in particular can't resist future gazing. It's in our DNA to dream up an engaging story by starting with a simple question, what if? History suggests that writers have a better track record of foreseeing world events and technological advancements than think tankers and TV talking heads do, or maybe not. One school of thought says fiction writers don't really predict the future, but to the points made here already today, their stories merely prompt policymakers or scientists and engineers to think differently about a problem, and events unfold along the same lines sketched by authors. Now, having worked as both an engineer and an aerospace journalist, I can testify that writing techno-thriller novels is more fun than solving real-world technical problems and reporting hard news. Authors can dream up wild stories and high-tech weapons, yet never worry about those annoying constraints like facts and physics. We rarely have to be concerned how a futuristic system would actually be designed, built, and employed. Now, that said, though, authors are surprised when future-gazing scenarios and systems they wrote about years earlier actually come to pass. So rather than predicting the future, I think we merely look at a geopolitical situation or technology and extrapolate forward several years. So I'd like to share some of the futuristic space-related capabilities that started as what-ifs and ultimately were incorporated into SpaceWars, CounterSpace, and the Permit, the books Rachel just mentioned. So please consider the potential impacts if America's smart scientists and engineers actually developed and fielded the following. A maser beam weapon that disables an adversary's satellite by creating mini electromagnetic pulses in electronic systems on board is feasible, and sources claim it's been done in the Navy's China Lake labs by initially firing a laser to create a momentary wave guide or filament through the atmosphere, then firing a maser's microwave pulse down that channel. Hypervelocity weapons delivered from a piloted space plane in low Earth orbit. Basically a titanium bar boosted by a rocket. These rods from God can take out an underground nuclear facility without an explosive. A dense material propelled at hypersonic speed delivers a tremendous amount of kinetic energy in a brief time span. Basically, a rod from God has the impact of a tactical nuclear weapon, but leaves nothing behind that can be traced to the U.S. Coyote mentioned space-based angels and demons. Now, angels are small, stealthy spacecraft that are deployed in orbit to protect high-value satellites, our satellites. Demons hover near an adversary satellite quietly waiting. So in an emergency, demons can be activated and hit the bad guy, disable it in one way or another. If a soft kill is warranted, the demon might just squirt slime onto a target's optics to temporarily blind a reconnaissance bird. Another one was the Hoover anti-satellite system. Now this is a stealthy spacecraft that could vacuum up debris left in orbit by China's 2007 hit-to-kill test, for example, then parked behind an active Chinese military satellite. During a conflict, Hoover could silence its neighbor by firing orbital debris at the satellite. People's Liberation Army forensics experts would have to conclude that they had shot themselves down with their own space jump. You know, in the cyber war realm, here are some of the futuristic weapons and information warfare scenarios my co-authors and I dreamed up. Employing modern American fighter aircraft fitted with advanced electronically scanned array, or ESA, radar systems to launch a covert attack against an adversary's oil refinery and shipping port. In our counterspace novel, ESA radar beams fired by stealthy F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II fighters are combined to create mini EMPs that destroy microprocessors and electronic circuitry in a Venezuelan oil refinery's control system. Valves then randomly open and close, creating havoc and extensive damage throughout the oil handling and shipping complex. Bottom line is, Hugo Chavez couldn't ship a drop of oil for months, causing massive economic problems in Venezuela. And he had no idea what hit him. An electromagnetic or electrostatic system that remotely disrupts the electrical activity of the human heart. Fired from a drone or a manned aircraft, these tailored signals trigger heart attacks and strokes, covertly killing a rogue nation's dictator or terrorist cartel's leaders. And smart dust to locate and neutralize terrorists. These are tiny nanoscale systems that can be programmed to operate cooperatively, would be scattered from the air over a target community. Microscopic hunter bots could be programmed to search for the DNA of a particular suicide bomber. When they get a match, they'd clear their companion killer bots in, and they would be ingested by a terrorist's wife, children, or siblings. Now, these bioagents coating the killer bot nanoparticles would radically alter the target's behavior, ultimately causing considerable shame to be heaped on the suicide bomber's memory. Soon, nobody volunteers to strap on the suicide belt. The ultimate cyber attack might be a biostatic signal that affects a person's brain by altering his thoughts. Maybe a wannabe suicide bomber's thinking could be reprogrammed, inspiring him to leave his explosive vest in the attic and just keep driving the cab. Along the same line, what if biostatic signals could be tailored to a particular person's DNA, enabling the insertion of false images directly into the target's brain? So he thinks he sees an object with his eyes, but the object isn't really there. It only exists as an image in his brain created by these engineered signals beamed from a drone. The target can no longer tell the difference between what's real and what his brain falsely registers as if seen through his eyes. Now, what might be the effect of this brain spoofing, inserting false imagery? Could a political or military leader rapidly lose the confidence and trust of subordinates, rendering him ineffective? And then maybe he'd conclude that he is hallucinating and he's going crazy, so he's off the map. The bottom line is brain spoofing and cyber war weapons designed to interact with human biological systems would be invaluable for instilling fear, doubt, and division in an enemy force. Such wild-eyed concepts and scenarios may be confined to the realm of fiction, never to be realized in the real world. But perhaps the mere possibility could be developed in a field that is enough to neutralize threats. That's why authors and screenwriters really are a form of cyber warrior. Historically, as mentioned earlier, fiction/entertainment has been employed as one of mankind's most powerful vehicles for shaping perceptions. Stories are no-harm, no-foul vehicles, allowing one to suspend skepticism and barriers to belief. After all, we're just being entertained, right? Hollywood's been using stories as subliminal programming quite effectively for decades. For example, movies mentioned earlier in the 1950s and 60s, such as On the Beach and Dr. Strangelove, portrayed the horror of nuclear war in vivid, personal terms. So did those stark movies and literature of the time help shape policies and decisions that prevented nuclear war? It's hard to tell, but maybe they inspired us to collectively decide, let's not go there. A second example we can make a tighter connection to, the China Syndrome. It's a gripping movie about a nuclear reactor crisis. It was released in 1979. About 3 weeks later, the 3 Mile Island reactor accident occurred. So the combination of a fictional movie and a real-world accident virtually killed the nuclear power industry for more than 30 years in this country. So perhaps it's a stretch to classify fiction and entertainment as soft cyber war, but what if? What if fiction authors and Hollywood screenwriters were engaged to create entertainment featuring advanced, horrific weapons and tactics that instill fear and dissension among terrorist bands and deadly criminal cartels? Now, what if these stories rapidly spread throughout a culture through books, TV shows, the internet, and movies, capitalizing on the power of entertainment to shape perceptions? What if such a campaign were already underway? Maybe it is.
I think when we think about this issue, when we talk about cyber, a couple points I would just want to make for consideration of this group, and one is how we've already got into Google Glasses, right? That cyber is not just about a computer any longer. It is about any technology that has a chip in it, right? It's a technology issue. The vulnerabilities and therefore the opportunities for offensive purposes, whether they're our offensive capabilities or asymmetrically others, all devolve to each one of these areas of technology, whether it's Google Glasses, whether it's biomedical implants. We had a cybersecurity researcher who has diabetes who became quite interested in whether he would be able to hack into an insulin injection pump, which he then put on the other side of the room, recognizing that more and more often technologies have remote access capabilities, typically to allow for remote diagnostics. Right? Who wants to have surgery a second time when you can remotely change your insulin injection pump? Now, of course, doing that for ill purposes is not quite as beneficial as just, recalculating the insulin. So he was able to do that. We saw the same thing with automobiles, where everybody's auto right now has about 50 chips in it, 50 electronic control units. If you have anti-lock brakes, there's a chip that's controlling your braking. If you have cruise control, there's a chip that's controlling your acceleration, and your entertainment system is connected to both of those. And some of our cars, you'll actually see when the anti-lock brake set in your stereo goes down, right? It starts lowering, so you realize it starts beeping. Well, the converse of that is if someone could get into your entertainment system with a CD, they could control your brakes or your acceleration. And these studies, proof of concepts, have been done both with regular access and then remotely, because there's Bluetooth and the like. And then when we think about information and information systems, you've got data and you've got the systems themselves with the critical infrastructure as we've been discussing. And when we think about the harms, you're thinking about confidentiality integrity and availability. Everybody in the paper, you're hearing every day about confidentiality. Someone stole your data. But that's not what keeps most people up at night, right? That's what makes the papers. But the eventuality of having integrity problems where you cannot trust the data that you're seeing is far more of a problem, right? And so the idea of Google Glasses, right, or the idea that you just mentioned, right, where you could alter perceptions through technology. This is the digital equivalent of the Mission Impossible movies where you have the camera, you create the picture of an empty room, you put it at the right focal length, and then you can do anything in the room that you want. That's happening, and it has already happened by mistake for the electric power grid, where the sensors weren't sensing, it was saying everything is okay. Meanwhile, there was cascading electrical failures, and Midwest went without electricity because of that. Now, I'm reminded that anything that can happen by accident can happen on purpose, right? And so that one was accidental, but don't get false sense of hope that when you see something, well, it wasn't intentional, because the bad guys are looking at those as possible exploits. And then we have issues of availability as well. Now, when we talk about availability, you're thinking of DDoS attacks, right? I can't get to my website. Well, that's okay. You might have saw what happened last year with Saudi Aramco, largest, wealthiest company in the world, where one day they find 30,000 plus computers had been completely wiped out, just destroyed. Right? It's not just a case where someone's going in to see information. So you can walk in and your infrastructure is gone, no backups or the like. But when we're talking about this level of availability, there's one area that, I mean, the 1 Second After is one of the most significant books ever, and for this incredible work to bring up the potential of what happens when technology is no longer available to us, and there's a baby brother to electromagnetic pulse, and it's just purposeful interference, right? And so we're seeing people with $25 jammers who could interfere with any part of the electromagnetic spectrum, whether it's light or whether it's wireless. And if you think about how we've become very much reliant now on wireless devices and signaling, it's not really just about your phone calls, although it may be about those. It might not just be about being able to check your email, although it may be about that. It might be about critical infrastructure and the ability to actually change a train track through wireless communications. And then we have GPS, right? So, and when people think about GPS, they immediately think about positioning and navigation. But the one other area of GPS that we've grown entirely reliant upon is timing. And so if you could interfere with GPS, the timing elements that we've relied upon for interoperability of all of our systems would then be destroyed as well. And we're seeing the $25 jammers being used by teachers in school because they just don't like the fact that kids' cell phones are going off, right? So then we start seeing it used by organized crime. Now think about a criminal, a common criminal, using a $50 jammer in a situation that requires emergency responders to talk with each other. Maybe you're inside of a mall shooting up the place, or a school, or a movie theater, and you have jamming equipment that does not allow anybody to communicate, right? That starts to look significant. And if you raise that to spread that spectrum, we're hearing now all of the alarm systems of houses and places of business, they're telling you they're wireless. That's okay, right? Because now you can't clip the landline and use to. But if you had a jammer, then your signal is not going out for emergency response either. And when you start taking this picture of how vulnerable all of these systems are, how increasingly personal they're getting, biomedical implants, devices that are changing your perception, critical infrastructure, all of our data, the entire economic system. And think about this. Mike McConnell once stated the following, which I thought was quite interesting. He said, everybody knows that in our economy there's no gold standard. So there's precious metal that reflects every dollar we have. What most people don't realize is there's no dollar that represents every dollar we have. At the end of the day, these are accounting entries that are getting rationalized, right? In the trillions of dollars, we've grown reliant upon data integrity and security for most everything, and increasingly so, in ways that we're very quick to market and not very prepared to have any sort of resilience or reliability or secondary systems in place should those fail. One of the really truly remarkable aspects I always felt about your novel is showing how in an area that is not densely populated, where you would think it most likely that people can survive without the technology, was still utter chaos, confusion, and death. And so you could only then imagine and extrapolate from there what is happening in the major cities. And when I hear people talk about a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor, I'm quite dismissive of those as being appropriate analogies. But what I do believe is that we very much can see a cyber Katrina, where you don't have resources, you don't have potable water, you don't have electricity, you have all of the cascading harms that are reflected, which are every bit or more as devastating. And those are real possibilities, and nation states recognize it. China, years ago in the China Daily, in one of the publications, said that electronic warfare will make or break nations. It will be the life or death of nations. They recognize that. This is quite serious, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with everyone here. And so I actually do think that there are solution sets here. One area I believe is that we have failed in any meaningful way to exercise common enterprise risk management. So we've treated the entire internet and all technologies as one thing, so that everyone needs the same level of privacy, everyone uses the same internet protocols. This is quite preposterous. When I go to the gas station, I can't use a diesel pump to put gas in my regular car just because the nozzle won't fit. But when I was working at the FBI, I had an unclassified computer, a secret computer, and a top secret computer, and I could use the same thumb drive to move data back and forth between all of them. That has to change, and those computers were differentiated only by the sticker that was put on them, because the computers themselves were the computers that are available to you. So that's the first thing. We've got to figure out that there are different priorities and that our security posture needs to be different depending on those priorities. The second thing is that you cannot have meaningful security without meaningful threat deterrence. It's not a possibility. Threat deterrence. And so when you think through the risk model, you only have 3 levers to work from. You could lower the threat, you can lower the vulnerability, or you can lower the consequences. That's what you get to play with. Those are your opportunities. We have seen the almost tunnel-like focus on vulnerability mitigation, as though it were ever possible to create software and hardware that would be impenetrable. That is as absurd, or actually more absurd, than thinking of doing the same thing in the physical space, of having physical environments or people that are impenetrable to disease or intentional conduct. That is not in any way, shape, or form a possibility. It is even worse, I would posture, in the technology era, because it's less static than a building, right? It's constantly evolving and changing, new software, new hardware, new applications, quicker to market. And so what you see as a result of this is that for crimes of opportunity, vulnerability mitigation has worked in the area of cyber. So you patch your systems, right? You update your software, and the common criminal doesn't break into your system. They break into the systems that haven't done that. That's the same as in the real world, right? If someone just wants a TV and your house has the door locked, they don't go to your house. They go to the one that doesn't. Now, query for a second, if everybody locked their doors, what would happen, right? That would raise the need of what your best practices need to be, because now all of a sudden they're going through windows, right? And then before you know it, everyone has bars on their windows. But that's not how we do things in the real world. We don't then start first with locks, then with bars, then with huge silos, and before you know it, everybody's living in underground bunkers. That's not how we work. We immediately shift to threat deterrence once standard vulnerability mitigation opportunities are not cost effective. And we put up alarms, we put up video cameras, and those basically say to the adversary, we concede the ground. It's no longer about us any longer, right? It's about you. You can get in, but now we're going to detect you, we're going to find you, and you will suffer penalty-based deterrence. It won't be worth it for you. Could you imagine if in your place of business the alarm went off at 3 in the morning and the monitoring company calls you and they say, someone just broke through the front door of your place of business, but don't be concerned, we have the locksmith on the way. How absurd, right? We don't do that, but every day, tens of thousands of times a day across this country, we have enemies who are trying to break into our critical infrastructure, into our military institutions, and the response has been to tell the Chief Information Security Officer, make sure you're continuously monitoring to patch your systems. It doesn't work, it won't work, it will never work. So the next strategic opportunity is, after we figure out what's important, to make sure that we build the software, hardware protocols necessary for assurance, attribution, and penalty-based deterrence. There are opportunities there that I think actually are a happy coincidence. And I would suggest that in a lot of areas where security is the most needed, the privacy rights are actually not the most necessary. Take the electric power grid, for example. The electric power grid is a high security entity that really does not want anonymity on its systems. No one should be touching those systems. The owners, operators, employees of an electric power company want perfect attribution. So that's an area that's ripe for new software, new hardware, new security institutions, new policies that say if you are found in our infrastructure and we have designed the system for attribution, there will be penalties. That is an unacceptable, whether it's unilaterally or bilaterally or multilaterally. We have declared that to be a meaningful red line, hopefully. And so I think that there are opportunities, but the first step is to distinguish what we need to protect, to build in proper threat deterrent models to assurance and attribution, and then the policies that actually will follow up on making those a reality.
Sir.
How far ahead is Russia and China in aggressive EMP, and how actually fairly better off they are, not quite as perfect, in defense against EMP?
Offensively and defensively, they're light years ahead of us. We found when on the EMP Commission that Russia has developed what they call a super EMP weapon. That is a new generation of nuclear weapons that is specifically designed to create EMP. They're basically a gamma ray producer. Very low yield on the order of a couple of kilotons or even less. But it generates a tremendous EMP pulse, an E1 pulse of like 200 kilovolts per meter. That is, for every meter of dimension in the object being attacked, you get 200,000 volts. So if it's 2 meters long, that's 400,000. And you multiply it by the dimensions of the thing. So if you can imagine the numbers of meters that are in things like telecommunications lines, which run for kilometers, you multiply that by 200,000, and that's the amount of energy.
Is this from space and hits 100 miles, 1,000 miles, or what?
Yeah, well, anything above 30 kilometers. The EMP phenomena begins up at above an altitude of 30 kilometers, but the ideal attack would be to place one about 400 kilometers over the center of the country. That puts the EMP field down over all 48 contiguous United States, and at the horizon, you know, with a 200 kilovolt peak field, you know, you're talking about 100 kilovolts per meter at the horizon. Defensively, Russia and China are the only countries in the world that have hardened their infrastructures against EMP. You know, they did it back in the Cold War because they believed you could fight and win a nuclear war. At least the Soviets did. And we now know fairly recently, because it's only been a recent discovery, about the so-called underground Great Wall that the Chinese have built. Thousands of kilometers of underground facilities, very similar to what the Russians and the Soviets before them did. And they have hardened their critical infrastructure.
Peter, excuse me, I want to add one thing. The fact that the Russians or the Chinese may have a new and effective enhanced radiation weapon doesn't mean that that's particularly complex or difficult or high technology. It just produces more gamma rays and less blast, and is very similar to an enhanced radiation weapon that we had back in the 50s and 60s for use in a war in Europe. So that's one of the insidious things about EMP is if you look at the capability of either Iran or North Korea to launch an accurate ballistic missile attack from any place on a target in the United States, it's stunningly difficult. But Iran now has I think, 3 satellites up. All were launched to the south, all like a south polar orbit fractional orbital bombardment system, since all of our indicators and radars and so forth are pointed north. You launch it, it goes into orbit or half an orbit, and then it detonates. It's not that sophisticated. And so they have 3 satellites in orbit and are, I would say, less than a year away from having a nuclear weapon. Primitive North Korea has 1 satellite in orbit and 3 nuclear tests, all of them relatively small yield, as they would be if they were electromagnetic pulse weapons. And so it has nuclear tests, satellite. Iran has satellites, no nuclear test yet, but both are very close to where, in terms of capabilities for EMP, not for accuracy, very close to where the Soviets were on the eve of Sputnik. I was in high school when Sputnik was launched, and boy, I can tell you, the public schools of Oklahoma, and I think probably much of the rest of the country, went to general quarters. I mean, everybody was, we're changing everything. No, you're going to take 4 years of physics. You know, Sputnik had a huge impact on this country's reaction to the threat of nuclear war. And you now have 2 considerably crazier powers than the old Soviet Union was, namely Iran and North Korea, with one with both of the systems that they need, satellites and nukes, the other with the satellites, but not yet the nukes, but 20% enriched, 9 months.
Can I just follow up? How many members of the Joint Chiefs of Command could say more than 2 sentences about this?
I don't know. I don't know.
Can I ask one quick clarification? Did you say 1 to 2 kilo, not 20 kilo?
Yeah, 1 to 2 kilotons or even
So we're
less.
talking about the potential of operational use, say like detonated 50 miles off the coast of Israel and 30 miles up? That could take out,
Yeah, it's a bad day for
Yeah.
Lebanon and Egypt.
it'd be a bad day for Lebanon and Egypt, but it also blinds, it takes out Israel.
But
Yep.
let me follow up with that too, because the commission, as the Russians told us, we were visited by a delegation from Moscow, 2 Russian generals who were
Fascinating.
their top experts on EMP, to warn the commission that there had been a technology leak from Russia to North Korea on the secret of the super EMP weapon, and that they predicted, this was in 2004, that within a few years North Korea would be capable of developing a super EMP weapon. And a couple of years later, in 2006, they did their first test, which was, and all of the tests have been the same. These low-yield weapons, 1 to 3 kilotons. The Western press has tended to declare them to be failures because the yields are so low. I mean, a nominal atomic bomb should have a yield of about 10 kilotons, but these are on the order of 1 or 2 kilotons, and no leakage of radionuclides from the tests, which almost always happens, which indicates something like a pure fusion weapon, which is consistent with the super EMP weapon. In 2012, a military commentator for independently of us, South Korean military intelligence came to the conclusion that Russians were in North Korea helping them develop super EMP weapons. And then in 2012, a military commentator for the People's Republic of China said the North Koreans have got super EMP weapons. So, but to make matters worse, you don't actually need a super EMP weapon, any nuclear weapon. Our grid is not hardened at all, nor are our other...
2 cities, Indianapolis and Denver, 120 miles up.
Or anywhere above 30 kilometers, anywhere over the eastern seaboard. You could use a meteorological balloon to get up that high. There was a gentleman who did he was an acrobat, and he had himself lofted up into the stratosphere above 30 kilometers with a heavy diving suit, demonstrating that you can get up to that altitude. We knew it before he did that. One of our concerns was you could use a meteorological balloon to lift any kind of warhead up to that altitude, do it anywhere over the United States, preferably someplace over the eastern seaboard, because the eastern seaboard generates 70% of our electricity. And the country can't survive without the eastern grid. You take down the eastern grid, it's all going to collapse.
Iran is now developing more drones,
Yes.
many other countries. So how would that change the game?
I don't know that it would. You could do it with a jet fighter. They've got jet fighters. Any fighter that can do Mach 1, if you do a zoom flight high up and pilot's willing to commit suicide, you can do an EMP attack that way too.
One factoid in support of this. The deputy director of ARPA-E, ARPA for the Energy Department, did this calculation himself and told me about 3 months ago that the amount of relevant R&D done by the 3,500 American utilities is in toto less than the amount of R&D that is done annually by the American dog food industry.
Makes
But
sense.
we have healthy dogs, hey. There's two cases, Peter, you may know both of these, but let me just mention them quickly. One was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were two Soviet attack submarines that were armed with nuclear mines, I believe. And when the United States set its blockade and it began depth charging Soviet submarines, it scared all of them except these two to the surface, and the others did what the Americans wanted them to do, which was to surface, and okay, now nothing's going to happen. But the two that had the nuclear mines on them, it was this big torpedo that could go in a distance and then fight guys. It was a mine, I suppose. There were 3 guys on those 2 nuclear boats that could decide to launch the torpedo/mine against an American ship. 2 of them, it was like Yeltsin, 2 of them decided to launch. One guy, he was a Navy captain, and he was the commissar of the baby little fleet that had just the 2 boats in it. He said no. And all this came out after the Berlin Wall went down during those few years in which we had pretty good access to Soviet documentation and so forth. But that one's been written up a fair amount. The other one, that also the materials come from the same place, was that even without being a religious fanatic, Castro was just a fanatic, and Castro did everything he could, really, to get a nuclear war going between the United States and Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He knew it would kill him. He knew it would blow up Cuba. He didn't care, as long as it would destroy the United States. Yet again, Yeltsin one time, and this Soviet Navy captain another, there was a sensible Russian military officer somewhere in the system who told Castro to go to hell. You don't have to be a Shiite cleric with a vision of going immediately to visit the 72 virgins to be crazed enough in some circumstances to want a highly destructive war. Hitler wanted to rule Europe for 1,000 years and kill all the Jews. He was very careful planner about those objectives, but he had them for years. Secular, non-theocratically crazed leaders that have their hands on nuclear weapons are also a problem. You don't have to just be a religious fanatic. In, I think, the summer of 1912 or 1913, a Austrian intelligence officer wrote an analysis of the situation in Europe. And he summed it up by saying that the situation in Europe is so complex and there's so many interdepending alliances and flashpoints that could go wrong. I believe that sometime within the next 2 or 3 years, such may occur. And we would then move toward a general war in Europe. If that happens, the situation in Russia is so difficult, there would probably be a revolution in Russia. Count von Berchtold, the Austrian foreign minister, took one look at this stupid intelligence analysis and scribbled on the margin, "And who, pray tell, will lead this revolution?" This idiot Bronstein who spends all day playing chess at the Café Central? Trotsky.
When you talk about you can spread this idea through movies, so it will scare our terrorists, would-be terrorists. When it comes, for example, to radical Muslims, they read only the Quran. So they don't want to know anything about anything, so their exposure to influences that we can be influenced by are not there. So you're limiting it. England announced yesterday that they are working now on development of cyber attacks, which has been kind of very interesting, so I would like you to comment on that. And just two more things. One is with 9/11. I'm from New York. In New York, you couldn't call anybody. There was no communication whatsoever. All the towers went. And now when we had the hurricane again, the same thing. We couldn't communicate because cyber is gone. So landlines, nobody has a landline anymore. You cannot talk to anybody. So that's very minor issues, but yeah, we know what it is to be without communication. Talk about implanting ideas through cyber. We have Google Glasses now, right? Well, you can do many things with that. You can develop it further, and you can implant change if you work on the nervous system, if you know a little bit of neurophysiology. You can do many things in order to change perception, to change behavior as well.
How difficult after an EMP attack, within 4 months, 80% of all Americans are dead, that within 2 years, China can repopulate the western half of the country, infrastructure's all there, bring their own transformers, and re-energize the country within 4 to 6 months.
You know, I look at you as more of the expert than I, but that sounds, credible.
It's a spoiler. He just did the spoiler.
It's not that hard.
Right, I mean, you really have to be prepared when you think about...
They would be here to save us. We'd be greeting them with open arms.
Yes, but
that's
because they're the
California.
bosses. Don't fool ourselves. They would be the boss.
Well, it's also because it's California.
I said western half to the Mississippi.
Again, I keep thinking about constituencies and building public support and building political support. We have to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of Bill Nye several years ago. We all know Bill Nye, the science guy. He put together a really neat little video called How, I think it was television or how media gets EMP wrong. And then 15 minutes, it was at an EMPACT conference where all of us were sitting there, gothic humor type, just laughing at how utterly absurd EMP was being portrayed. Such as a scene in a film where it's like, well, we're going to EMP Las Vegas, but then you only have 30 seconds and the power will come back on. We have a great task before us. Many of the things that you cited, sir, and you as well, are so fantastic, but so real. But Hollywood gets it so wrong. And therefore, when we present realities like what you've been talking about, it gets dismissed. We need to be able to get better information out from an organization like ACD saying, this is not Hollywood we're talking about
We
anymore.
should make a new movie.
Movies, documentaries, whatever.
Yeah.
One of the things that pushes me right through the wall is National Geographic's preppers and all that, which makes anybody preparing for these scenarios look like they're wearing a tinfoil hat.
Yeah.
So it behooves us to figure out strategies for communicating politically and also the constituencies. We're talking realities here. This is not sci-fi.
Bill, there is a unit that I'm involved with a little bit called the Entertainment Industries Council.
Thank God. Please explain that, because I'm hearing this for the first time right now.
They were formed to address exactly that problem, the inaccuracies in media, particularly in entertainment, of course. And what was happening was, on a lot of TV shows, particularly the daytime shows, medical practices were being grossly misrepresented. So doctors, hospitals, etc., they wound up teaming through the EIC with the screenwriters in order to get it right. And Why? Because they were having lots of people, particularly women, going to their doctors and saying, well, I want this, this, and this, because I saw it on TV and I know it can be done. And they would say, no, the science isn't there, or that's totally inaccurate or something. But they've had a major impact, such that a lot of TV shows and movies are now much more accurate in the medical arena. So if we were doing, I guess maybe through the ADC, work with those people a little bit better in order to start bringing a little more realistic science into these movies. There's a movie now being made of our first book, SpaceWars, and thankfully the producer has kept my co-authors and me involved from day one, because the first script they wrote was so divorced from the book. And we said, why bother?
That happened to you too.
We're now on the 5th version of the script, and we're buying off on it now. But that has to be part of the practices, is that Hollywood has to be able to work with the original writers and the smart people that know how it really works in order to get it right.
I have them call me from time to time, not because I volunteer, to advise about things like this. And my overall experience is that they really don't care at
Exactly.
all
You're right.
how close something is to
Right.
reality. It is entirely the impression that is created and the tension and so forth. I can't even get them when they're talking about CIA officers to say officer instead of agent. As far as they're all concerned, all those guys out there are CIA agents. James Bond was 007, so it must be true of the CIA. They don't care
That's right.
about any verisimilitude. And it's... it would be great if they did, because it would be good for the public to be somewhat informed by things, but
Well,
I think it's pretty
It wouldn't
hopeless.
be hard to do, Fly Guys, Dave and I were driven crazy by the opening scene of Top Gun. Okay. So there's the so-called MiG, and there's the F-14 on top of it, right?
Yeah.
And they pass it off as a MiG, and it is just an F-5. They don't care. It doesn't matter. And then the famous scene when Chuck Yeager goes supersonic. It's just ethereal religious experience, the colors change and everything. And you say, you gotta be kidding me. Well, they try to dramatize it when all that really happens is an eagle does this and then you're supersonic. And that's it. It has to be dramatic, and unfortunately, realism and accuracy goes by the wayside. So it's a tough problem, but the EIC is doing a good job.
Yeah.
Is 80% of our country convinced that human nature is basically good, which not one of our founding fathers said was true, and that was what scared them the most, and they wrote about it in the Federalist Papers.
Right.
If you have a conviction that human nature is basically good, you're profoundly given to wishful thinking, and you don't want to hear any of this.
Right, exactly
It's just
right. Whereas we do checks and balances because we don't trust people, and and neither did those guys in that hot summer in Philadelphia. They wanted to make sure that if you were going to do something crazy, you got checked. And the American system operates on that, and it's you're exactly right.
But it's also okay. So if you're not good, we can negotiate with you.
If you're not good, we'll make lots of concessions, so you'll be nice.
Maybe you'll like this someday.
I want to ask a mental question. I'm sorry to say this. Could you teach in an emerging mobilization of training logic and rationality to help you in a situation in which rationality is falling apart, that you don't panic? Now, you may be all by yourself, I admit that, but what I can see, even through the dynamics of the book sort of thing, they were helpless. They had no concept, they had no preparation, they never expected anything. It took them a long time to even figure out what was happening. But I think that's another big factor. No kid graduates from high school who has one clue of what logic is. Now, I know that's an inflated balloon, but I do think a lot of it is preparation.
Well, I'm from Israel. I grew up in Israel. We are prepared for terrorist attacks. We are aware of our environment. Bags are being checked. If you see a car parked for a long time, what is this car doing here? You go and you call the police. We don't treat the police as the enemy. Everybody is being checked all the time. This is why Israel has been able to prevent many incidents. But we grow up with this. So, you know, I was living in Israel and doing research and traveling a lot. I remember going into Harrods in London, and I opened my bag. And I caught myself. I said, what am I doing? Somebody will take my purse, you know? Because when you go anywhere in Israel, you open your bag for inspection. American civil liberties, oh my God, you know, violation of our rights. That helps you to create an awareness and to think in a fashion that will expand really your ability to react, I think.
So we invest somewhat in logic.
Yep.
How could we engage with 16-year-olds that they wouldn't take all this stuff as fluff?
Well, we have to start
submit-
earlier, not at 16.
I would submit that what he and I are doing is one way. Because if you can turn the logic into entertainment, you know, then it gets through, even to the younger generation. And that was the epiphany that I had as a writer for Aviation magazine for 22 years. I finally realized that even though I was writing for the premier aerospace magazine in the world, coming out weekly, I wasn't having near as much impact as Tom Clancy, Dale Brown, Steve Kuntz, and Dr. Forstchen, you know. Because once you wrap a story around the facts and the logic such that it hits here, that it gets to the feeling part of people and says, wow, that can impact me. So, for instance, in our Space Wars book, we tried to do exactly that. We said from day one, it's an event-driven book, it's not a character-driven book. Of course, we've taken a lot of hits for that. But we tried to say, if you knock out GPS satellites, how does it affect our daily life? And when you say, I go to the pump to get gas, and I can't get gas at the pump. I go to the ATM machine, I can't get it. We say it's like pouring molasses on society. Everything slows down and we revert to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We go inside to pay. We go inside to get cash, that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, the feedback we were getting was, I had no idea space had anything to do with my daily life that way. So I think we may have to do that same sort of thing with cyber. So.
I agree, the older generations, if we'll allow ourselves to be called that, have this view that younger generations understand the technology, and they don't. They know how to use the technology, but they have no idea how it works. And so they're in no better position to rebuild on a technological basis, and certainly have no way of getting back to grounded on a survivalist basis because they've grown quite lazy in their reliance on technologies. So it's unfortunately not usually as simple as even giving up the technology and reverting, because we've put ourselves in a position where there's nothing to revert back to.
That if something goes wrong, you fix it and make it perfect, because that's the way it was designed to be, and that's the only worthy objective. You neglect an entire aspect of things you can do, such as use software in such a way as to make islanding a lot easier, and to have some, maybe not a whole supply, but some solar on the roof and battery in the basement, so that if the grid goes, you can island and you can at least have, let's say, 40% of the electricity you might have otherwise, 30%. But the difference between 30 or 40% and zero is the difference between a serious problem and the end of civilization. And people somehow get into the business of something goes wrong, you got to fix it, and it has to be exactly the way it was designed and we want it all to be, not build in resilience, figure out a way that we can at least cope, at least charge a cell phone and something, even if the grid goes. And the whole attitude toward risk, and it fits in with what you were saying, I think, earlier, anything fails, let's get in there and fix it and make it all perfect again. And anything short of perfect is worthless.
Right, it's this idea of restoration, that you're restoring the original as opposed to converting or pivoting to another factor that won't be similarly vulnerable. The problem with the restoration view is that you could keep It's like the scene in Cool Hand Luke where the Paul Newman character keeps getting up just to be punched again. The idea of restoring to standing up is of no value if you retain the same vulnerability and the threat is out there, right? You might have to pivot, and we haven't been thinking that way.
But the examples that you give, going back to Bill, is right, because you remember movies, you quote movies. This is part of the, okay. So
I agree.
we have to do something,
But then they better be accurate.
Yeah.
So I agree there too, right?
Even the testing that I did for years, the idea of graceful degradation. So if you lose something in the air, you still have enough to get yourself
The
on
helicopter
the
can
ground.
still get down.
Yeah, or you go to
Yeah.
reduced instruments. All the electricals are down, but you still have a little standby attitude indicator, and I can get on the ground.
Somehow, though, the aviation industry, I think, has grasped that, at least in my exposure to the electricity business and so forth, they have not. Indeed, the whole infrastructure has not. My wife and I are sailors, and whenever you sail under a bridge, you tend to see cable crossing, terrorist, if you want to cut something, cut it here. We've gone from 1865 until 9/11 with, except for a few months after Pearl Harbor, without a single thought being given by anybody who had anything to do with the American infrastructure that anybody might attack it or do anything. I mean, nuclear war, yeah, with Soviets, but our infrastructure has been put together without a single thought being given to resilience. It's not that it has some flaws, it's that nobody thought about it at all except in protection of nuclear power plants. That's it. But even then, they'll often have the transformer outside the fence so the terrorists can take out the transformer, just not the plant.
Perhaps, Sid and I have talked about this. I refer to it as islands of recovery.
There you go.
Being in the Charlotte area, Lowe's are great big box home repair depot systems. Perhaps at some point, ACD should be talking with some of our major private industries, like Lowe's, for example, forming an alliance as the idea of an island of recovery, that they know how to begin rebuilding an infrastructure, that if the crap hits the fan, you know that you can go to these various points of islands of recovery to get emergency issues taken care of, but also to begin the rebuilding process. In the same way we see the changing of strategy with mobile warfare, World War I, World War II, where linear defense was simply just punched through, and the realization you had to have defense in depth. That you had islands of recovery 50, 100, 150 miles back to re-stitch together, as the Germans did in Russia in 43. So perhaps we should be talking at some point about which major private corporation should we be approaching as becoming allies in islands of recovery.
There's also some other potential allies that might strike most all of us as fairly odd. I gave a speech not long ago about all this resilience and electricity grid and so forth to a group that had been a mix-up, and I was speaking to it was an extremely left group, a large group of students. And the idea of being spoken to by a former CIA director, they were just about to run and start throwing stuff.
Was it better than the Tracy's experience?
I started talking about this resilience stuff. I started paying attention. They came up afterwards, a bunch of them. They said, "You know why we like this?" I said, "We're all locavores. We won't eat anything that is grown more than 100 miles from here. We think everything ought to be local, and we've never heard anybody who had anything to do with industry somewhere talking like that." So the idea of resilience and being able to do some things locally, not everything, but some things, fit together in the minds of a lot of people who would be very uncomfortable in this room and would be wearing their Birkenstocks and all that. But there's some interesting folks in that world who have some very parallel ideas.
For example, Whole Foods. Whole Foods concentrates on buying food when they buy mangoes from, I don't know, South Africa, but they also have local, and they increase their local sales of local products. So maybe talking more with them. They are conscious, at least starting somewhere, in order to get more, awareness for that.
Reagan promised Gorbachev, I will give you all of our advanced technology for what became known as Star Wars. They couldn't believe it. They didn't have much money to start with. So the larger question is, what could we do to go to the Russians and ask them to give us their advanced technology on EMP defense? Maybe it's a pipe dream?
Well, how
It
much money can you
prob-
get together to give it to Putin? I don't know.
It probably is with Putin, but it might not have been at some point with Gorbachev or Yeltsin on some things. They didn't think the way Putin does.
You know, most cities have emergency plans for whatever kind of emergency occurs in those cities. And a lot of these issues must be addressed. Maybe, you know, they don't necessarily care if it's an EMP-driven electrical failure, or if it was like 10 years ago when the East Coast effectively went down from Canada to Ohio. So it seems to me there's an awful lot more being done as far as emergency readiness on a city by city basis, and there's conferences across the nations in terms of, you know, what best can we do and what are you doing and how are you preparing, and so what are they not addressing this sufficiently, obviously, but are they not addressing it at all, or where could that be strengthened? Because they're the first responders,
I'd
right?
like to take
I
that
live in-
question.
Yeah, okay.
You know, if you go to the local and state level emergency responders, you will hear a refrain from them quite often that the Department of Homeland Security says that they will be there in 72 hours. 72 hours.
I believe them.
Yeah, and you know, and I think it is self-evident that the lack of preparedness, Katrina, Andrew, Hurricane Sandy, that just happened, and that we knew was coming 2 weeks in advance. You know, it's appalling how unprepared we are, even for normal meteorological events that nature throws at us, tornadoes. So, no, we're not really anything like adequately prepared, even to deal with natural disasters. And if we can't cope with a Katrina, we're not going to be able to cope with an EMP.
And if I can throw in just an additional comment, you know, we deal so much with commercial entities, and commercial entities say that their response is already planned and calculated. It's called insurance. And if they have a disaster, they'll simply go out of business and accept the insurance payment.
Yeah.
I can. I was teaching at the Army War College, and we were looking at this issue. We found out that what we believe most people would do would be to come immediately to military facilities if there were a large catastrophic event. And they would come there for protection, for food, for water, for whatever they thought that the military facilities would have. Unfortunately, as the Colonel knows, military facilities are no longer set up that way. We do the same kinds of consumer, just-in-time consumer businesses as the civilian population does.
Everyone
We would-
except China Lake is on the grid.
Yeah. So
If
we
I-
would be,
Yeah.
If I could throw a corporate model, sir, you were involved with Woolsey for many years, were you not? I think this is worth listening to for a minute about how a corporate for-profit enterprise deals with a disaster. So, sir, if you'd introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Greg Westling, and I currently work with the Noah Foundation with Sid Morris. But I spent almost 35 years with Lowe's. And the story starts in 1989. That's when Hurricane Hugo came to the Charleston area and devastated, at that time, 53 of Lowe's stores and thousands of their employees and hundreds of thousands of their customers. And the truth is, we were so flat-footed we didn't know what to do. We learned pretty quickly that the time to plan for a disaster is not 5 minutes after it occurred. And so we got through it, and we vowed to put in place a program that would never put us in that position again, aimed at our customers first, but certainly equally to our employees. And it kind of answers your question. Most disasters have boundaries, and people know best how to work within those boundaries. Some of the things that you folks are talking about today have much broader boundaries, and that's why I think they're a much greater threat. Back to the Lowe's story, so we spent a couple of years developing strategic plans, putting in a disaster recovery center, which I've spoken with Bill about on several occasions. What we learned were three things. One, if you can come back quickly and help the community can get back on its feet. But because a store like a Lowe's requires people to work inside the store, you have to take care of your employees. And they won't come to work unless they know their families have been taken care of. So we put a plan in place to take care of our employees, the employees' families, and then in turn they could come to work and take care of the communities. And then we build a logistics plan to get the product back into the stores. People think that's easy. It's not. The road that you used yesterday to get generators to the store or roofing products to the store or whatever the disaster may be, it's no longer open. And even if it is, people that would like to have those generators or that roofing don't want it to get to the store.
Right.
They want it, Jim, you know that. They want to take it and they believe it's theirs for the taking. So it's a tremendously complicated plan. We spent 20 years perfecting it, and I'm retired now from Lowe's, but I know that plan is alive and in place.
If I could just elaborate for a second, it is an actual disaster center at their corporate headquarters, staffed 24/7, has timelines and clocks. Like, for example, we talked about Sandy, that a week before Sandy hit, while the government was sitting flat-footed, you were already pre-positioning emergency supplies and emergency equipment for your personnel and for the community recoveries. The disaster at the Sanford, North Carolina tornado incident, you had a full reaction team in there within 12 hours.
Well, New York didn't have anything. Sandy happened, and
Why?
hospitals were out. Everything was out.
I'm intrigued with...
Not NYU.
NYU. No, what do you mean? NYU?
It did not go out because they had a cogen system set up in such a way that they'd done
NYU,
over
all their computers went.
well, most of the heating and cooling and water and so forth. Get lots of. I have two sons who live very near it, and a lot of people from around that part of New York who heard about it were going to NYU, and it had to do with the way their natural gas and solar and cogen and so forth was set up. It was kind of done over the dead body of the utility, but they had some resilience.
But their computers went, so they didn't have any computers.
Well,
so
at least they still had civilization.
Yeah.
More
Yeah.
so than-
Yeah.
To close, my point to close is there's private models out there.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, please.
I, listening to Bill talk, we were both at Aviation Week where we did information writing, which is the who, what, why, how, when, where, and then storytelling, which I've been studying since Bill became a novelist. These two fellows do the character, narrative, motive. It's more appealing, but very few thriller novelists get the information in there at all, much less write. It's kind of anathema to storytelling. But I think you could develop a communications plan for EMP because it's a discrete problem with a solution that has money that's reasonable, whereas cybersecurity is broad and diffuse and much more challenging problem. And the thing is, I think you could go to the best narrative nonfiction writers in the country. You could get these subject matter experts in front of Mike Lewis, who wrote The Big Short, and John McPhee, who wrote a story about nuclear bombs, and talked to the fellow who designed some of our largest and smallest nuclear weapons from the New Yorker, and he was in the World Trade Center towers, and he said to this fellow, well, what would happen with a small nuclear device? He said, it would knock the two towers into the river. And then he wrote a magazine article and a book, but you can identify the very best narrative nonfiction writers in the country and go to them. And since the media industry has collapsed into everybody does everything and nobody knows anything, you find the people who know, who are concerned about getting the facts right, and then you go to them. They don't have time to get up out of their desk and come down here to Washington and meet with you guys, but if you had a communications program with a little money behind it, it wouldn't have to be a lot. You could get some impact and then maybe build consciousness to get a bill passed to, was it $500 million?
That's a very interesting idea.
Well, they usually require big advances and publications that will publish them, and it's a big problem. Yes.
I want to ask, how can Lowe's make this region by region a national missionary effort?
I'm probably not qualified to answer that question.
I'm
as a-
talking about human spirit.
Well,
I'm talking about the board of Lowe's.
well, it's there. I mean, the philanthropic arm of Lowe's has been alive and well for over 50 years. So I think getting a group together that has a plan and a need with some folks with the company could yield some real results.
One of the points that I would stress are the number of assumptions our emergency response plans have in them of what is still available to you as a resource. And that's really what you need to press against, right? This notion that we have employees, it was absolutely brilliant and necessary to recognize that your employees are not coming to work if their families are not taken care of. We saw that in Katrina, that public citizens, right? You have people who are public servants who are trying to, but if their families are in harm's way, they're being put into a bad choice. We've done exercises, cyber exercises, where it's assumed that the internet is still working. On a cyber exercise, no less. And so you're saying, well, what if it's not? And we're like, well, we're not ready to handle that exercise yet. And it reminds me of this economics joke for those of you who don't really think that macroeconomics have really brought us where we need to. It's an economist is trapped on an island. And he's trying to figure out how to get off the island. And he says, well, assume I have a helicopter. And so those assumptions matter. And what we're talking about today, right, are that the assumptions that are built into a lot of our emergency response plans are invalid.
And one way to vet that is through good wargaming.
Yes.
And wargaming is not adequately used in a lot of circles. The
I agree.
military does a good job. The Navy is the best at it. But my co-author took wargaming. He's a wargaming expert in the Navy, in the commercial community. And what he found was that most large corporations spent lots of time and money developing a 5-year plan. And as soon as something happened that wasn't in the plan, over the shoulder, and they were just winging.
Right.
So what he taught them was how to look at alternate futures. And, to say, if this happens, then what?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly
Very
what is
good.
necessary, because you can blow those assumptions out of the water.
Right.
That's crucial, and what often happens is after the first round of the wargaming, they change the assumptions so that the really tough stuff can't come up again.
I would also like to add there, the reason why the Air Force, and I'm going to throw a little jab at my own service, the Air Force is notoriously bad at wargaming because we want to exercise everything. So every war game we have always ends in a nuclear war. And but we end up inviting policymakers and diplomats and think tankers, oftentimes arms control people, to our war games, and so they think any move we make automatically concludes in a nuclear war. And we have actually carefully trained our arms control community to take us down because we expose them to bad wargaming.
Yes, please.
Very interesting, going back to the original question, which is why don't we have a constituency and how can we get one? And if we can raise the specter of this class of high impact threats that makes it impossible for others from far away to come rescue us anytime soon, but before the fear sets in, create the hope that all of us can create 20% or so of whatever we need to survive locally so we can help ourselves and our neighbors, then what we can do is enlist everyone at the local level to be empowered to do something, as opposed to telling them, you are helpless, you're incompetent, you need me to rescue you. So just vote for me or do something in Washington, as opposed to let me in Washington or let me in the state capitol empower you to do something for your community. And so somehow we need to change the game and change the mentality that local is where the hope is. And
Become community organizers.
And I want to say something.
That's true to a large degree, is that when a disaster happens in a locality, you get some things go really bad, but you get people being unbelievably helpful to their neighbors.
I want to say something optimistic because it's hard to come by in this area. I'm in a venture capital business, and one really exciting thing over the course of the last relatively few years is what's happening to batteries. 15 or 20 years ago, a battery was a battery was a battery. You did not have bright young graduates of Caltech and Stanford and MIT starting up battery companies. You do now. I tell you, they're all over the place. And they're using all kinds of new technology, and they get it. They understand that you want them to be cheap and reliable, that you don't want to have to buy the ingredients from China and so on and so forth. The combination of the progress that solar cells have made, they're not as much as you'd like, but they're a lot better than they were just a couple of 3 years ago, makes it possible for some limited amount of load and generation to match up the load with the generation and to be able, from batteries in the basement, not sexy high energy density batteries that go on a Tesla, but just big, lunky, safe, cheap batteries. Batteries in the basement, solar cells on the roof, and 20, 30, 40% of your electricity, even if the grid goes. That builds into the system a certain degree of and it's not complicated, and you can people are now starting to do this, and that builds a certain amount of resilience into the system that makes it possible to still have some food, some communication, some of this, some of that. And you're starting to see this in developing countries, sometimes on a very primitive level. In the markets in Bangladesh today, you can buy for about $25 about 3 watts, not kilowatts, watts of solar panels, a tiny radio, a cell phone charger, and a little fan. They all run, and a little battery, and they all run off the solar panels. So the wife and the family doesn't have to walk 5 miles to the next village to get the cell phone charged by a really expensive diesel generator. The little fan, you can sit in the shade and it'll keep you cool. The kids can read at night. Whoa, it has 3 LEDs. So the kids can read at night and do their homework. Changes the life for about $25 of a Bangladeshi in a village. A Bangladeshi in a village is going to be better off than most of us if the grid goes down. He's at least got 3 or 4 watts. We ain't got nothing.
Right, but look where we are. We're talking about survivalism instead of dominance, which is, I think, a pretty sad state of affairs for this country.
But you got to survive before you can dominate.
I agree. But it's quite remarkable, right, what we've got into.
Basically, the Noah Foundation's whole fundamental reason for being was read Bill's book. Quite a few sleepless nights, decided that get Peter and Cindy come down, and they came down and met with our little war room about what we were going to do about it. It boils down to one thing, is you've got to be, the only person that's going to protect you is you and your family. So you've got to start there with the family. NOAA stands for Neighborhoods and Alternative Homes. And our whole concept is, if you were to go on our website, you'd see that we've developed a system where, like Jim's talking about, where every family for very low dollar can start at level, we've got the basic plan, a little better plan than that for water, 6 different ways to get water, food. We've just developed an emergency food supply program for hospitals that were very close to finishing up a 40 hospital package for one of the largest hospital groups in the Charlotte area. The hospitals are required to have 72 hours worth of emergency food supply. They said that's the rule. And they said, well, we've got it. Where is it? Well, our food suppliers got it in the warehouse. So every day they bring a truck in, and if that truck didn't get there, then they would have a hospital with no one to eat. So we put a program together. It just so happens that our food system that we had developed was from the Amish, and it was healthy anyway, and it was a very low sodium. Whoever thought about having healthy food for long-term food storage when you have to have an MRE to give a soldier a lot of energy? So they're now buying our program to put it on site, and we can put enough food in a closet to supply that whole hospital for 3 days. And then it all just needs water, and so they came up with a water program because of the power line. We didn't have any water, so it wouldn't do you any good, because if you don't have water, you turn the faucet off. So all we did was we developed a 2,000-gallon tank that set in line with the city water supply that automatically shut off if the power went off. There's 2,000 gallons already there. So you just add the water
you hate it, you feed your husband.
Somebody put on the theater screens in January 1938 a really scary, realistic movie about what was coming to Britain.
Yes.
If they'd done that in 1938, they would never have given away Czechoslovakia. And I think it's really critical that we find different modalities to reach the broad public, which is only going to respond to something that rapidly grabs their attention.
There's
a lot to
real
that.
quick with an example.
We have to speak with Angelina Jolie, I guess.
That one example of how quickly you can change the mentality of a group, I thought was absolutely brilliant by the Missile Defense Agency a few years ago, because they were taking a lot of hits in the media. This is stupid, we don't need it, it's too expensive, it doesn't work, right? So out there, close where I live in Colorado Springs, Falcon Air Force Base, MDA brought in reporters from all over the nation. So we had the New York Times, we had all the big ones there. So as an Av Week guy locally, I was placed in this exercise. It was all done by computers mostly, a little bit of war game there. And, you know, my task was to fire 6 missiles at interceptors when things were coming out of Korea. But it was fascinating because they let the New York Times guy, who was the biggest critic, he got to play president. Okay. And it came down to where he had to decide, you know, do I take a chance on losing this city or that city? Because if I make the wrong decision and one of them gets through, we're in trouble. That was so powerful. You could see overnight how the tone of the reporting changed on a nationwide basis. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that analogy fits in here, but it's a tool that really works to address some of the media problems that Dr. Pai was talking about.
Well, we've got to do something with them, because what they're doing now is
So wargaming would
completely
be useful.
unhelpful.
Wargaming is a powerful educational tool.
So in business, they talk about it more as scenario planning.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a better
Yeah.
analogy than wargaming, because it's still
No,
a
scenario
what if
you're right.
question.
Yeah.
And what if this scenario comes to place, and what
Yeah.
if that scenario comes to place, and, you know, and in fact, I mean,
And maybe
scenario
people-
planning by Shell was credited with South Africa coming out in such a non-lethal manner from apartheid.
A lot of people get spooked by the word war, and so might as well call it
Scenario, wonderful.
And, I mean, and it is used in business world all the time,
Yeah.
so I think that it does make sense.